I'm going to introduce our panelists now who are joining us to talk more about this. Edmund King is the president of the AA. Lakshmi Moorthy is the managing director at Arval. Matt Freeman is the managing consultant at CAP HPI. And Simon Ridley is a managing director at DawsonGroup, which is one of the UK's largest van rental groups. Thank you, all of you, so much for being with us this morning. Reminder to you watching at home or in the office, please do send your questions in. We will get to as many of those as we can in the next 20 minutes. Edmund, I'd like to begin with you. Is that right? Is electric demand accelerating? Is it green for cars? And just talk a little bit about the biggest barriers. Is charging still the biggest barrier for most consumers?
Yeah, I think, Peter, when we look at cars, it is pretty much green. When I think back 20 years, when I had my first EV, a little Ford Think car that had a range of 35 miles and quite often ran out of charge if it was raining, and I had to use the windscreen wipers and then had to call the AA to get me home. And if I think from then till today, the actual range of cars has changed significantly. Between 2019 and 2020, there was a 71% increase in the range of cars. And I think if you look at some of the cars, they're not just the best EVs, they are the best cars out there. There are some incredibly good cars. So I think that's making a difference. You know, if you think back 5 or 6 years, the early adopters, in effect, had to have their anoraks on because the cars weren't that great. You had to be dedicated to get an electric car. Whereas today, you know, you can be a petrol head, you can be someone who loves driving and find a really good electric car. So I think that is a big change. And we've found, talking to fleets, you know, in the last few years, the percentage that now say they are looking at electric vehicles has gone up to 68% from about 19% a couple of years ago. Of course, there are still barriers. There's the initial purchase price. People still worry about range and stuff, although it really isn't as big an issue as people make out. You know, the majority of people, if you can charge at home or at the depot, that really helps. But part of it, I still think, Peter, is that we need to reassure drivers. And I do feel that a better education towards electric vehicles, sometimes from the manufacturers, sometimes from government, sometimes from fleets, all of that will actually help the transition and speed it up. With vans and HGVs, I agree, there are much bigger problems. You know, at the AA, we've been looking at vans for our patrol fleet, and, you know, we are talking to different manufacturers, but currently there isn't an equivalent EV of our transit style van that we use for patrols that's got the towing capacity or the load capacity that would work for us. So I do agree that those sectors we need to look at, and we need to speed up development there.
No, exactly. Thank you for that. Lakshmi, if I can ask you, obviously have a global perspective and leasing perspective. Now, Caroline from the DFT was telling us that actually leasing wipes out the problem of a high purchase price on electric vehicles. How are you seeing demand across your business?
So first of all, morning, Peter. It is true that leasing makes it more accessible for people to access EVs, because we do know that today the purchase price of an electric vehicle is higher than an ICE car. So it is true that leasing helps. But again, I would say there is a distinction even there within certain segments. So if we look at company cars, for sure, taxation really helps with the running cost because it's really attractive today. And when I talk about company cars, I also include salary sacrifice schemes, which give a more democratized access to other employees as well through their companies. But if you look at a pure personal contract hire, for example, I think that price advantage is still not enough. And I think it's not something we can take for granted. And I would say certainly that's one segment where we need to look at continuing foresight and incentives and continue to watch it, because otherwise the retail market, the pure retail market, will still lag the company car market.
So it sounds to me like it's still pretty heavily subsidy driven, right? On the company car side. Do you have an idea in your mind of when we actually move beyond the time that subsidies are required to get people to buy EVs, either through company car schemes or just leasing them as normal consumers?
I guess that's the $1 million question. There is no, and I was reading an article on the FT on the weekend. The government does have a challenge. There is a revenue gap that needs to be closed. But equally, I think this is where, and I completely empathize with the challenge the government has, but I think a siloed approach where we have one goal on sustainability for the Department of Transport and different KPIs, different metrics in the revenue department won't help us in the UK as a country. The poll showed people think we are lagging behind. I think demand is there, it's growing, it's grown, it's on steroids for the last 12 to 18 months. It's still fragile. So I think what we need is not sudden changes. We need to phase them out gradually. And I think this is where the industry will come together with government, aided by associations like the BVRLA, to find the right long-term sustainable solutions. But I don't think it's time yet to pull the plug on subsidies and grants. Demand is still fragile, especially retail, private contract hire, vans. We still need this to continue.
You've seen, lots of places across the world where the demand has been pretty robust, and then governments cut the subsidies, and then, demand has collapsed. Matt, can you give us your perspective on this? Because obviously, at CAP HPI, you guys have, all the data, all the numbers, and all the insights. How is the UK in terms of demand compared to other places? And do you think it's robust? Do you think it's fragile? And where needs more help?
I think if we're talking about the new market, then demand, certainly for the fleet market, obviously is very, very strong. I mean, I think we've got about 80% of battery electric vehicles are going straight into fleet. It's similarly high figures for plug-ins. So from that side, we can see that, that lever works. You give those generous tax breaks, then people are going to take them, and they're going to be in that in the market for those vehicles. The big question we have, of course, for our business, because we've, as well as forecasting values, we're looking at current values, is where are we going to be in 3 years' time when they all start to come back? There's a bit of a conundrum here. If we want them to be affordable for used buyers, we don't necessarily want really strong residual values, because that makes them expensive in the used marketplace. For the new market, of course, we want strong residual values, because that gives you that parity with ICE. I think as we go forward, and because we're going to have more volume flowing through, so we had 108,000 BEVs registered last year. They're going to come back in 3-4 years' time. That's a lot of volume. It's a supply and demand equation. It is going to have an effect. What I think we'll start to see, though, is more of consumers will start to become more selective. They'll start to be able to apply some of the old rules that apply currently around brand and specification and segment and so forth. So there'll be winners and losers. But I think there is a growing recognition in the wider driving public that this is where we're going as a nation, along with everyone else, that it's a challenge for everybody. And the government has set targets that are quite ambitious targets, and automotive and transport has to take part in that.
Can you talk a little bit about current pricing? Because we've seen, because of the semiconductor crisis, we've seen the used market going, for want of a more technical term, bananas, right? That the used prices are above new prices at the moment. Has that affected EVs in the same way? Has anything different happened to them that hasn't happened to ICE cars?
They lagged a little bit. All the electrified technologies lagged ICE, but that has picked up in the last few months, and that is probably because of supply. Because all of those ICE vehicles, we've gone through them, and now it's a knock-on effect into the electrified vehicles as well. So yes, they are starting to show the same kind of trend.
Perfect. Thank you. Simon, obviously you run one of the UK's largest van rental groups. Look, tell us about, I know there isn't very much supply in the van side. Is there any demand there at all at the moment?
I think in the sector that we trade, which we predominantly trade in the smaller fleet sector, there's very, very limited demand at the moment. That's really being driven by the total cost of ownership that's perceived for the electric vehicle in a light commercial marketplace. the cost of the vehicle, upfront cost for the small user to actually fund. There is a high residual value currently on that vehicle, but if you look at that high residual value, people are being put off by the fact that that residual value potentially in 3 years is almost at the price of a fleet discounted ICE vehicle, brand new, which is a bit of a challenge for users as well. And I think we as an industry have got to encourage that grant to remain in the light commercial sector for a considerable amount of time. My call would be to have more grant available for that light commercial vehicle. The business case is very, very tight for people to actually pull towards electric vehicles. And we have to see more pull incentives from the government to actually encourage people to take electric vehicles in the future in the light commercial marketplace. The supply of electric vehicle in the marketplace is very restricted at the moment. There's no real hybrid vehicle out there other than one that applies to that actually has the grant available to it as well. So we have some challenges, and even though the grant will remain for the next few years, it's still subject to change, and that could go downwards as well as upwards. I can only hope it goes upwards, to be fair, or the price of the light commercial comes down, which is probably unlikely at the moment.
It's interesting that you say that demand isn't there, but obviously supply, I know we're coming on to supply in the next panel, but supply isn't there. Is it the case that once the product is there will be demand for it? If you look at, passenger cars, nobody was asking for electric vehicles 10 years ago, but now that they're here, lots of people want them.
But within the electric car marketplace, other than the corporate governance pull, which every organisation should really look at quite strongly about how they're tackling that issue. In the car market, there's a big incentive. There's a big pull incentive of the benefit in kind that is pulling people towards electric vehicles in the car market very rapidly, including people like myself. But in the van market, there's no real pull incentive to encourage the local business operator, the small business. The van market is dominated by small businesses. The vehicle park of 4.6 million is very much small operators. The larger fleets are showing some massive signs of encouragement by adopting electric vehicles, which is the right thing for them to do, because that business model there is getting close to them with benefit in kind, NI savings that they can get for private use on vehicles as well. It is encouraging that's happening. The ability to take that vehicle in the congestion zone as well as a light commercial vehicle is a big incentive for people in that area, but there's very limited pull incentives for organizations to adopt electric vans.
Thank you. We've had lots of questions come in. Thank you for those. I'm going to attempt to get through two in our final 2 minutes. First question is for Lakshmi. Have you looked at leasing used 3-year-old EVs? Is there going to be demand for that? And is that presumably the way to try and get people into used EVs, which are, as Matt said, still actually quite expensive?
That's a very timely question. Some of our earliest EV cars start to come back exactly this quarter, so it's an excellently timed question. The answer is absolutely yes. And I do think this comes back to also a bigger social challenge we have. EVs are still at the upper end of the spectrum. And we know people in lower income households do buy or lease used cars. So yes, absolutely. I think leasing of used EVs is part of our strategy, and it makes sense also for us to increase usage, because we know people need to try sometimes before they buy. Leasing a used EV may be the step to then taking a new EV, but it also means we can make it more affordable to more segments. So absolutely, yes.
Perfect. Thank you. We've had a question come in on the aftermarket, which I'm going to put to Edmund very briefly. Electric vehicles obviously have less to go wrong than internal combustion engine vehicles in terms of moving parts, but there's some studies do actually show that they cost more to repair. Can you just talk a little bit about the implications on this for the AA? I mean, you must be a different skill set, and how often do you get called out for electric vehicles that have run flat?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, all our patrols are trained to deal with electric vehicles, but 99% of people overestimate the number of electric vehicles that break down due to battery running out. In fact, the proportion is less than 4%. It's halved in the last few years. And if you look in Norway, that's more developed EVs, it's less than 1%. So running out of charge is a relatively small problem. Ironically, the biggest problems are the same for combustion engine vehicles. It is the wheels, tyres, punctures, and the 12-volt battery. So those are the biggest concerns. You know, on the used market, I mean, it is interesting. I looked on AA Cars used portal yesterday, and they've got, you know, about 1,600 models. And yes, the prices are higher. But one of the questions we do get quite a lot is, what about the battery life? You know, what will happen? So I think more needs to be done there, you know, warranties, checks. And as we've just heard, leasing of used EVs, I think that will give people more confidence in those broader markets.
Perfect. We've got lots more questions, but we are out of time. So thank you very much, Edmund, Matt, Lakshmi, and Simon.